Hey guys, NegroVMX here, and time for another episode of Clearing Confusion. Well, it seems you guys pretty much loved the first episode. I suspected as much. A few people asked me whether or not I'm taking requests or suggestions for topics. Yes, feel free to suggest a topic. If it's confusing to you or to anyone and it has to do with games, then yeah, it's a topic. That's not to say that I'm definitely going to do the topic that you suggest, but you'll have better luck than you did with the urban legends of video gaming. Anyway, let me tell you guys a story. My friend Joey once told me about a shabby individual that he talked to that proclaimed with all certainty that Final Fantasy VII was the first Final Fantasy game. I mean, what? Joey sure as shit laid into the guy with the fury of frenzied mocking that left the person a shadow of their former self, but really, you gotta wonder about that. I mean, how could it be the first? When asked why, if it was the first game, the game was called Final Fantasy VII, the person, who I will just call Moron, said, because 7 is lucky. Even if you somehow were born with an extra chromosome or two and you're dumb enough to believe that, what about this game? Or this one? Or this one? Yeah, there were definitely Final Fantasy games before 7, and even if you weren't aware of them, assuming that it was the first and they just called it 7 because it was lucky, pretty much means that you should be deprived of oxygen. Now you might be saying, Necro, you've already covered this in the history of Final Fantasy. Yes, but I'll be going more in depth this time, and I'm pretty sure this video will reach a wider audience. But I digress. The Final Fantasy series and its wacko numbering have proved confusing to more than just people with severe brain damage. It's proved confusing to just about anybody. Even myself at a time. When Final Fantasy VII came out, I was in high school. Some guy was talking about it, and I expressed my confusion as to how the series skipped from 3 to 7. I mean, I just got the idea that there were possibly games that only came out in Japan, but 3 was not that long ago. I doubt that 4, 5, and 6 all came out in that short of a span. And it wasn't like 3 was really old in Japan. It had only just come to America. It had cutting-edge graphics, so what's the deal? The slightly less confused person told me that in the game that I knew as Final Fantasy III, in Japan, was 6. When I asked about then what happened to 3, 4, and 5, he simply shrugged and said he didn't know. I pretty much didn't think about it too much after that, perhaps thinking that he was mistaken, but I found out a few years later when I got into emulation. Some games weren't released here, but instead of keeping the numbering the same, Square changed it so that the second and third games that were released in America were called Final Fantasy II and III. The reasons why the missing games didn't come out here are varied, and I'll get into it in a little bit. But it lends you to the question, if the numbering for the series was different in America because of missing games, then why was Final Fantasy VII also not renumbered? It was the 4th game released here, so why not call it Final Fantasy IV? And what about games such as Mystic Quest, Final Fantasy Adventure, and Final Fantasy Legend, Legend 2, and Legend 3? All this will be answered. Well, first let's explain what exactly happened with the missing games. In some cases, like with Dragon Quest, some games were not released in America due to the fact that the series wasn't popular in America as it was in Japan. But Final Fantasy was one of the few turn-based RPGs to be released in America that was a huge hit. Sales were certainly good enough to warrant a sequel. Final Fantasy II was on the same system, the NES, which in Japan is called the Famicom. It looks the same as the first game, at first glance, but has new gameplay mechanics and a deeper storyline. The game was going to be released in America as Final Fantasy II Dark Shadow over Palakia. The problem is, Final Fantasy II had a lot more plot than the first game, and therefore a lot more text. Square were not used to localizing a game with this much text, and the project was dragged on and on. Eventually, it had taken so long that the Super NES was out and Japanese gamers were already enjoying the 4th game in the series. The English version of Final Fantasy II was cancelled. Although it was close to completion, the American video game market abandons consoles in favor of new ones a lot faster than the Japanese market. and by the time it would have been finished, releasing a new NES game would not have been as financially viable as it would have been when the localization had started. The third game, Final Fantasy III, was also on the Famicom, and while Square wanted to release it in America, once again time was the leading factor in it never being localized. Many years later, a cartridge was found with the almost complete translation of Final Fantasy II. The game was fully translated but unedited and contained many errors in spelling and grammar as well as text formatting. This cart was so rare that when fans of the series went to translate the game all on their own, they were not aware of its existence and had to work from scratch. As far as anyone knows, no working beta of a translated version of Final Fantasy III was ever discovered, and it likely won't be, as the localization was cancelled much earlier on. But once again, fans have translated it on their own. The fourth game, Final Fantasy IV, was the first on the Super NES, or Super Famicom in Japan. The game was successfully translated and released here, but Square felt uncomfortable with the title Final Fantasy IV. They didn't want to anger fans who had waited so long for a sequel by hinting that there were 2 sequels that they never saw. So the game was rebranded as Final Fantasy II. The next game in the series, Final Fantasy V, was going to be released in America as Final Fantasy III, but this never happened. The team working on it felt the game was unmarketable in Japan, as it was much more difficult than the previous game, which is funny, as Final Fantasy IV is one of the most difficult in the series, and the game had to be considerably toned down for its American release, and that it wasn't accessible enough to be a hit in America. Later on, Square once again tried to have it localized as a game specifically marketed towards experts in RPGs, called Final Fantasy Extreme. But even after being told this game was supposed to be hard, they still felt it was too obtuse to make a profit, and it was once again cancelled. A third attempt was made, this time to release the game on PC, but this also fell through. It wasn't meant to be, so the next game in the series, Final Fantasy VI, was brought to America as Final Fantasy III. So that's all well and good, but why not make Final Fantasy VII into the American Final Fantasy IV? Well, 2 reasons. The first is because of the Internet. The Internet was going from becoming something only hardcore nerds used to something that was becoming more and more common in homes. Information sharing became more common, and it was bound to get out that there were missing games in the series. So it was only a matter of time before Square's deception was exposed, so they might as well come clean. If that seems to you like there's more to the story, well, yes, there is. The second reason is that Final Fantasy VII was a huge hit in Japan, much more so than the previous games in the series, and Square felt that if the game was also a huge hit in America, they could re-release those old games that never came out here. So it was time to clear up all this shit with the numbering. So this is what I find most amusing. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Square went and cleared the confusion on their own by releasing Final Fantasy Anthology, which contained Final Fantasy V and VI, and Final Fantasy Chronicles, which contained Final Fantasy IV and Chrono Trigger, both collections being on the PlayStation. They then came Final Fantasy Origins, also on the PlayStation, which had Final Fantasy I and II, so American gamers got to play 2 and 5 for the first time and learned the truth about 4 and 6. Later on, 4, 5, and 6 would all be released again on the Game Boy Advance, and 1 and 2 also together on the Game Boy Advance. Final Fantasy III, the one that eluded America for so long, was even released on the DS. So you'd think there really is no more confusion, right? Well, the reason the confusion has come back has to do with the Wii's Virtual Console. When I heard that Final Fantasy II was coming to the Wii's Virtual Console, I thought, that's odd. The game wasn't translated, and PlayStation and Game Boy Advance stuff is not available on the Virtual Console. Then I found out that they were talking about Final Fantasy IV on the Super NES, only the American version that was called Final Fantasy II. Soon they're going to release 6 on the Virtual Console, but once again using the original American name of Final Fantasy III. This is ridiculous to me, and it confuses a lot of people. I mean, you can get Final Fantasy II on the Wii, or you can get Final Fantasy II on the PSP, and they're two totally different games. But the one on the Wii is the same as the game on the Game Boy Advance and DS that's called Final Fantasy IV. Then there's 3 on the DS and 3 on the Virtual Console, once again two completely different games. I know that they're just releasing games as they were in the original consoles, but all they had to change was the title screen. It doesn't take much. Another fucked up thing about the Virtual Console version of 4 is that there's a sequel to Final Fantasy IV called Final Fantasy IV The After Years Return of the Moon. What system is it on? The Wii, or more specifically, WiiWare. So the original game on the Wii is called Final Fantasy II, but the sequel is 4? Just when you think Square had stopped confusing people, Nintendo had to show up and cock it up. The matter isn't helped by certain fans who refuse to let go of the old titles, regardless of how illogical it is to be like that. People on YouTube say, playing through Final Fantasy VI, still refer to it as 3. All they have to do is play the damn Game Boy Advance version, or just call it 6 and explain what happened. But then you get people wondering if the DS version is a remake of that. Well, now the truth is out there, so hopefully you're no longer confused. But there are a few other things about Final Fantasy I'd figured I'd mention. Firstly, there's Final Fantasy Legend, the first game released in America called Final Fantasy since the original. It's clearly a spin-off of some type, but the gameplay is really different from the original game. There were 2 sequels, Final Fantasy Legend II and Final Fantasy Legend III. Well, that's all well and good. Years later, on the PlayStation, Square released a game called Saga Frontier. And if you're attentive, you'll notice a lot of similarities between Saga Frontier and the old Final Fantasy Legend games. That's because they're in the same series. In Japan, the Final Fantasy Legend is called Warrior in the Tower of the Spirit World Saga. Final Fantasy Legends II is called Saga II The Treasure Legend. And Final Fantasy Legend III is called The Ruler of Time and Space Saga III Final Chapter. The series continued in Japan on the Super Famicom with Romancing Saga 2, and Romancing Saga 3, and then on the PlayStation with Saga Frontier 1 and 2, and so on. So why were the first 3 games called the Final Fantasy Legend when they clearly don't have anything to do with Final Fantasy? Well, it came down to sales. Square didn't feel good about releasing the games in America, but they increased consumer confidence by connecting them to a game like Final Fantasy, which was already a huge hit. So yes, they're called Final Fantasy, but no, they're not part of the series. Also on the Game Boy was the Final Fantasy Adventure, a Zelda-type game. Now this one is clearly connected to Final Fantasy. After all, there are Moogles, you could ride a chocobo, and there are various other references to the Final Fantasy games. But when the game's sequel was released in America, it was called Secret of Mana. So what's up with that? A lot of people knew that Secret of Mana was the sequel to Final Fantasy Adventure, as it was originally unveiled as Final Fantasy Adventure 2. But why the name switch? Well, in Japan, the game we know of as Final Fantasy Adventure was called Holy Sword Legend, and in Secret of Mana was Holy Sword Legend 2. From then on, all the games in the series would be called something of Mana in America, while retaining the name Holy Sword Legend in Japan. They even remade the first game for Game Boy Advance as Sword of Mana. But wait, what about all the references to Final Fantasy? Well, before Final Fantasy, Square was working on a game called Holy Sword Legend: The Emergence of Excalibur, but they never finished the game and canceled it to work on Final Fantasy instead. There's more to the story, but if you want to hear about that, I recommend you check out my feature, The History of Final Fantasy. Anyway, they still had the IP Holy Sword Legend kicking around and merged it with a Game Boy game they were working on called Geminites, and that's how it happened. But it gets even more confusing for people living in Europe, because the game is not called Holy Sword Legend there, nor is it called Final Fantasy anything. There, it's called Mystic Quest. Now, I couldn't tell you why they did that, but hey, whatever. The problem is you're probably aware of a game called Final Fantasy Mystic Quest on the Super NES. It was a spin-off designed to be for entry-level players and was also a huge flop. That game came later, and when they released it in Europe, they called it Mystic Quest Legend, trying to boost sales by connecting it to the game we knew as Final Fantasy Adventure. Whew. Well, I think that's everything. Oh, wait. There is something else that confuses people about the series, and I hate to even talk about this, but I might as well. Why is it called Final Fantasy when there are so many sequels, and why do those sequels have nothing to do with each other? Well, asking why they call it Final Fantasy when there are so many is stupid. Yes, you are stupid if you ask that. Obviously, when you release a new game, you don't know if there's going to even be one sequel, much less 13 of them. The name actually came from the fact that Square was in serious financial jeopardy at the time due to sinking a lot of money into Holy Sword Legend, which was cancelled. The director of the game named it Final Fantasy as a dark joke. He figured it would be the last game he worked on, and it was a fantasy game. Because Square didn't know if the game would be a success, they didn't leave it open for a sequel. So when Final Fantasy II was created, although it shared graphics with the first game, none of the characters or settings were repeated, giving us a completely separate adventure, something which became a tradition of the series, always allowing Square to reimagine the series at the drop of a hat without having to wonder about continuity. So there you go, that's everything confusing about Final Fantasy. Join me next time and we'll talk about Kirby. Yeah, what's the deal with him anyway?